Greetings fellow Mistwanderers, my name is Steve Morgan and this is DM of the Mists, covering all things CoS of Strahd and Ravenloft. This was a video I was actually going to do much later on down the line, I think, but I had a comment on one of my other videos recently where someone asked what my favourite homebrew changes were to CoS of Strahd, so I thought I'd bring it forward. One thing I'd like to say first of all is that in the grand scheme of things, I'm not actually that experienced a DM. My current campaign, which had CoS of Strahd and has moved on to a wider Ravenloft campaign, admittedly is nearly at like 200 sessions and it's been going almost weekly for about 4 years now, I think. But other than Lost Mine and Fandalv, which I ran before, it's CoS of Strahd and a wider Ravenloft campaign, I've only run like a small handful of one-shots. And I've never run anything that's like entirely homebrew from scratch. And when it comes to the published modules, Lost Mine and Fandalv, I only made 2 changes to the whole thing. I just ran it straight out of the book, or the starter set. I added 1 NPC, and I changed the BBEG to be a 2-phase battle, the second phase of which took place in the centre of Phandalin. And even with CoS of Strahd, I probably say that on a scale of complete and utter homebrew to playing strictly raw rules as written, I think some people call it vanilla CoS of Strahd, I was probably much more this way, like 80%, maybe even 90% running it by the book rather than going homebrew. So the reason I'm saying all this is I didn't go wild with the homebrew. I'm not someone who likes to go more homebrew than what's in the sort of published module. But of the changes I did make, I think they worked well. I'm going to run through 7 changes I made, plus there'll be a couple of small honourable mentions at the end that I think were the best homebrew changes I made in CoS of Strahd. I'm going to run through them in roughly chronological order of when they happened in my campaign, so you'll have to bear that in mind. Number 1, the return to the village of Barovia. When my players encountered Doru, the vampire spawn son of the priest in the church in village of Barovia, he escaped. And they didn't really land many hits on him or sort of experience what a battle with a vampire spawn is like. When I first introduced Strahd at Yester Hill after the battles with the berserkers and druids and stopping the ritual, I had him kind of say, that poor boy visited me, the priest's son. He came to me after he escaped, asking what he should do, and I sent him back to the village of Barovia. And so they realised, oh, we've got to go back to the village of Barovia and sort him out. So they knew they'd have to go back to the village of Barovia and deal with Doru. And it worked out well because their fated ally was Rictavio, Van Richten, and he thought it'd be a good test to see what a vampire spawn is like in battle properly. I found this cool map of a Barovian house interior, or probably just like a general haunted house. If I find it, I'll put it here and also share a link in the description. And in addition to Doru, there were some swarms of bats, swarms of rats, and I think I put a Strahd zombie in there as well. And it ended up being quite a fun encounter, and I gave them proper experience in fighting a vampire spawn, which I thought was good, because then when they went to the coffin shop and opened the boxes that had 6 of them, they were like, oh, we struggled to fight one of these dudes, and now there's 6. We're in trouble here. It also ended up giving them quite an interesting quandary, story-wise, which was that they wondered if Strahd was trying to trick them. And that if they went to the village of Barovia, he would attack or carry out a siege against Vallaki. Irina was there after all, and they'd escorted her there. But then they thought if they don't do anything about the village of Barovia situation, the village of Barovia people are doomed. So that was quite an interesting quandary. They were like, should we just leave the village of Barovia and stick around, stay close to Vallaki and keep Vallaki safe, or what have you? Number 2, Victor survived the coup. So the Wachter coup happened in my game. And in the book it says that if that happens, the Baron, the Baroness, and the Baronet, Victor, are captured and executed. But I read somewhere on, I wish I could find the source, it was either Facebook or Reddit, whoever it was, kudos. And I've mentioned this a few times in a couple of other videos, so sorry if you've seen me say this before. But what I had instead was the Baron was executed, the Baroness was actually let go as a mercy, but the most interesting thing was Victor. Victor, I had it that he tinkered with his teleportation some more and actually got it to sort of work. And that when the Burgomaster's mansion got raided, he leapt into it, but it didn't work fully properly. And he found himself bouncing around the whole of Barovia, where he would appear somewhere for a few seconds and then disappear and reappear somewhere else. And it might have been that he just appears randomly in the Amber Temple and then randomly in the Werewolf Den and then randomly in Berez. You get the idea. And they were, during the old Bone Grinder fight with the 3 hags, the Hag Coven, he appeared in the middle of that. And I just had him look around saying, "What's going on with you? What's going on? No!" And then he disappeared again. And they were like, "Who's that guy?" And then they find him later on outside the Van Richten's Tower, where what happened was he teleported near it, fell into his anti-magic field, realised he stopped teleporting, and then was too tired and too scared to leave the circle and was essentially just asleep outside the door. It also led nicely to a lead to the Mad Mage, because Van Richten said, "Oh, I don't think Greater Restoration will work here. We need a really powerful wizard to help sort this out." And they'd heard about the Mad Mage by the lake, and they were curious about him anyway. And I kind of gave them an incentive then to check him out properly and meet him. And I made some changes to the Mad Mage. That'll be one of the points later. Number 3, the Trial of Rictavio. As I mentioned earlier, Rictavio was the fated ally, and he was travelling around with them with his tiger in his wagon. There was a random encounter on the roads with just a group of Vistani, and I had it that Rictavio's tiger broke out of the wagon and attacked them. When they realised the reason why, the players were upset, and they decided they were going to turn him into the Vistani. And I was like, oh my gosh, how do I handle this? Like, there's no rules or anything in the book that says if this happens, this is what you do. So I pretty much had to improvise and homebrew. They took him to Argyll and Luvash first of all, and I had it that they said it wasn't their Vistani, it was Madame Ava's Vistani. So they, as an entire group, including Argyll and Luvash, travelled back to Sir Pool encampment. I asked for some help on the CoS Strahd subreddit about Vistani trials. How do they work? Are they just like regular trials? And I had an incredible response from somebody who said that in one of the novels, one of the Ravenloft novels, I believe it's The Enemy Within, there is a Vistani trial. And the way it works is that you have the seer, so in this case that'd be Madame Eva, is essentially the judge. One person acts as the defendant, a defense lawyer, and one person as an accuser, so the prosecution. They don't necessarily have to be, legalese. They're just like sort of that's their role, and they're just like telling it from those angles. And the suspect is allowed to tell their version of events as well. And what happened in my game is I think Argyll was the accuser. Even though it wasn't his Vistani, he was like, I'll take the role. And we all know what Argyll was like reading what he's like in the book. He took to the role well. And then one of my players decided to be the defendant because I think he just liked the idea of being like defense lawyer. And then the seer at the end of it draws some Tarocca cards and makes a decision aided by the Tarocca cards. Maybe the Tarocca cards give hints as to whether the person is guilty or innocent. In the end, Rictavio was found innocent, and what I did have as well was a plan where instead of like executing him or something, they were going to ship him off to Valachan, which is another domain of dread, which is a place where people are hunted. And I thought that worked well for 2 reasons. One, it's kind of fitting that Rictavio trained his tiger to attack people, and then he's being hunted by creatures like the tiger in this dangerous, deadly jungle. And 2, with the fact that I wanted to run a post-CoS Strahd Ravenloft campaign afterwards, mentioning Valachan and another domain of dread was kind of piqued the player's interest and was a good thing. And funnily enough now, we're about 3 years after that trial happened, and they're in Valachan right now. So one of those good things come to those who wait moments, I think. Number 4, Lady Wachter's Devil Guards. Now, while vanilla CoS Strahd tells you about the coup and tells you how it can be set up and how it happens, it doesn't really tell you much about what actually happens in a Wachter-run Vallaki. So at that point, you've got to pretty much improvise and homebrew anyway. One thing I liked the idea of, inspired by my players, one of my players in particular said he liked seeing loads of different types of monsters and battling different kinds and seeing what they do and can't do. And I kind of ran with that. And the fact that they were devil worshippers and there was already an imp that is existing in Vallaki, I kind of said, well, maybe they get some more devils summoned in. And then one time when the players had to sneak in because they'd been exiled from Vallaki, they snuck in and they encountered some guards. And some of them were just regular Vallaki guards, and some of them were like in robes. And I said they had like these long glaive-like spears. And then when they took their hoods down, we actually realised that they were bearded devils. And I also had a chain devil guarding the Wachter house when they later tried to attack the Wachter house. So I know people might argue it's not a very CoS Strahd thing to have things like bearded devils and chain devils, but I think it worked really well. The player was kind of happy to see, oh, what do these do? This guy's got chains. And got a flavour for different kinds of things as well. And, those kinds of monsters wouldn't normally appear in Curse of Strahd, so it was nice to be able to have a reasonable excuse to be able to add them in. Number 5, changes I made to the Mad Mage. The Mad Mage encounter is written, I made 2 major changes to it. Firstly, I found this great Reddit post. It's not on the Curse of Strahd subreddit, it's on like one of the sort of more general D&D subreddits, where they spell something Mad Mage, but with asterisks to kind of treat it as like a semi-spoiler. And what happens in that encounter is that sometime before they see the Mad Mage, they come across a book. And I actually did this anyway, where they just come across this book, and I said the wizard thinks it's a spell book, but all the pages are blank, as if like maybe it's either empty and unused, or maybe somebody's hidden the text. They then found the Mad Mage, and they all get kind of sucked into this misty sort of realm with him, and it turns out that they're sort of witnessing the battle that he had with Strahd when he was defeated. But it's limited to just the Mad Mage, Strahd, and it's just some gargoyles, I think, as some minions. And the good thing about this as well is my players had never seen Strahd in combat at this point. And so it kind of got them to see him and his tactics and the spells he could cast in a way that wasn't dangerous for the players. It wasn't that this was happening because they were fighting him. It was almost witnessing this past encounter and just seeing Strahd hurling all these spells at the Mad Mage. They couldn't attack Strahd or the gargoyles. If that happened, they would just kind of get sucked out temporarily. And all they could do is support and heal and buff the Mad Mage. And then it got to a point where the way to kind of get the Mad Mage to break out of this was either by giving him the book, but unfortunately they kind of all forgot about the book, which partly my fault because it was such a while ago and I didn't give them a reminder, rookie DM mistake. But they also had Van Richten with them, and I had him change his spell, so he had Greater Restoration. So he cast Greater Restoration, and then Mad Mage became, as we know, Morden Gaining. The second thing I did was I added a Candlekeep Mysteries adventure as a one-shot. So the very first one, The Joy of Extra-Dimensional Spaces, takes place in a Magnificent Mansion spell. So I had the idea that they go to the Mad Mage's Magnificent Mansion, and inside there they find a book, and one of the players gets sucked in, and Morden explains, right, you've got to all go into this thing to help your friends. It was essentially a Magnificent Mansion inside a Magnificent Mansion. The original adventure in Candlekeep Mysteries is intended for level 1 parties, so they were obviously over leveled. They were like level 6 or 7 at that point. So I added tougher monsters, added more monsters, and changed as well how it kind of worked compared to how it is in the book. I've wrote some notes and put them on Reddit about the changes I made and how it kind of all played out. I'll leave a link in the description. Number 6, a pet undead silver guard drake. All credit for this goes to Dragna Carter of Curse of Strahd Reloaded fame. This was in his version 1. I believe at the moment he's working on like a version 2 or like redoing all the documents. And he said revamping them. And for Argynvostholt, he suggests adding an undead silver guard drake to the bathroom on the 2nd floor. And it's kind of just like living in this bath. And it's not a threat, it doesn't attack the players. I don't know if I can't remember if it says this in it or if it's just my own sort of homebrew, but it was originally a pet belonging to Godfrey. The Tabaxi could speak Draconic in my party, and he took it on as a pet. They named her Sylvia and decided she was female. And it's amazing. I did one very simple thing that just gave it so much personality without realising it, which was that the only way it communicated, a bit like when a cat meows and a dog woofs, all it did was just look at the players and go, meh. And my players loved that. I'd just be like, oh, Aunt Sylvia's there, and she says, meh. And my players would be like, oh, she's so adorable, we love her. And it's just so funny how like they would have died for her, this little undead silver guard drake dude. This was quite close to the end game. Argynvostholt was the last place they went to before going to Castle Ravenloft to take down Strahd. So they didn't have a huge amount of time with her, although they did explore the whole castle with her, or a good chunk of the castle. And then she sadly died during the final battle against, I can't remember what she was fighting. I think she might have just been killed by a swarm of bats off screen, which is really depressing and like not a way to go. But she they were genuinely devastated when they heard that she had died. But obviously now, like similar with the Revenants, her soul was free, as was similar to the Revenants. And then what happened as well, because we're doing a post-Curse of Strahd Ravenloft campaign now, is they actually returned Argynvost's skull after Strahd had already been defeated, which kind of made the whole thing with the beacon being lit kind of pointless, unless they were to fight, you know, another evil in Barovia in the future, which they may do. So what I did as well is I said, that happens, which, you know, is kind of pointless. But he also gave them another thing. And there's a big flash of light, and this thing appears and it says, meh. And it's Sylvia, she's returned, she's now a Celestial, and if she dies, she reappears 24 hours later. So she was like a little angel version of her. And my players were ecstatic and was so happy that she came back, and they had more adventures with her. And number 7, changes to the consorts. Strahd's consorts, 3 brides and a male consort. I think a lot of people give these guys more stuff, more abilities, more agency, because in the book they are just vampire spawn, and if you're doing it vanilla, raw CoS, Escher's in one room somewhere high up in the castle, and the brides just defend Strahd's coffin. Some stat blocks I like the look of were in a DM's Guild resource called The Real Housewives of Ravenloft. I didn't run this supplement as is, but I don't even know for that reason why I stumbled on it and bought it and read it. But I did like the fact that it gave suggestions of how to tweak the stat blocks. So they were essentially vampire spawns with additional stuff. Anastasia, I think a lot of people play her as like a sort of a fighter warrior type. And I think I gave her fighter abilities such as Second Wind and Action Surge. Ludmilla, I played as a mage, so she had some wizard spells. Valenta as a rogue and assassin, so she had things like Sneak Attack and Assassinate. And Escher had bard spells, and I think probably Bardic Inspiration. And what I did in my game as well is that there was an encounter, it was on the way back from the Mad Mage, where on the other side of the lake by Vallaki, Anastasia appears with a few minions and is like, I'm going to take you down, I'll impress Strahd. And, you know, spoiler alert, she was unsuccessful. I did have more planned. I think I planned for one of them to be in Selenka Pass. That might be a lunch break hero suggestion, and another one to be elsewhere. But we had to end the campaign a bit quicker than expected. But they did appear, or at least Ludmilla and Valenta appeared during the final battle. And those are my 7 favourite homebrew tweaks for Curse of Strahd that happened in my campaign. I would like to mention some quick honourable mentions. I changed some of the random encounters, especially when they were high level. I've just released a video about that, so I'll do the thing where, depending on what device you're using, a box or a link or something appears there. Otherwise, feel free to check that out elsewhere on my channel. I did the dinner as a sort of diplomatic talk and a tour, which I know a lot of DMs do rather than in raw CoS, vanilla CoS, it's a trap, and they're trapped in the castle. I did it where he talks to them, meets them, gives them a few quests, gives them a small tour, and they met Rahadin and the consorts, and I forget her name without having to look it up. What's her name? Mad Mary's daughter. Gertruda, that's it. I obviously I edited this video, but it's probably like a minute where I'm just like typing at my computer being like, why do I find this person? With the werewolf then, I used a lot from Lunch Break Heroes. The biggest change being that Zelika is a lot more sympathetic, and then it's likely that the players will side with her, and then together they work together to fight Kirill. I did the classic thing where I moved Argynvost's skull from the castle to Berez, and it was the skull that Babala Saga rode around on. To be honest with you, my players love a good heist, and one of my players loved exploring the castle, so I was very tempted to just leave it in the castle and treat it as like a heist where they got to get it out. And if I were to run Curse of Strahd again, depending on what my players are like, I probably would do that. But I did also like having it that it was Babala Saga's skull that she was riding around in. And one thing that didn't happen, but I planned for it, I had to cut it, as I said, I had to wrap the campaign up earlier than expected, was I planned for there to be a Dullahan or Doulahan encounter on the way to Castle Ravenloft for the end game. And it was going to be Isaac, because when my players defeated Isaac, which triggered the coup in Vallaki, they beheaded him. and a Dullahan is the headless horseman, if you will. And also, the Dullahan has attacks where he can fire, I can't remember what the attack's called. I have a computer in front of me, I can just look this up. Fiery Skull. And it's a similar range, similar sort of damage to Isaac's fiery arm. So I thought it was quite fitting that, I could flavour it that the attacks were the same. The stat block, by the way, is in Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft, for those of you who don't know. As I said, I cut it in the end because I was worried about time constraints. And that's it for this video. Thank you very much for watching. I hope some of that is useful. I'd be interested to know if you did some of the same changes as me. What changes did you do? Did you do a change that I haven't mentioned that worked really, really well? Please drop a comment, or if you see this on Facebook or Reddit, comment there, where I tend to share it. The next videos I'm going to do that are about Curse of Strahd are likely to be how to handle TPKs. Ironically, for such a deadly campaign, there are quite a few ways that players can either come back from the dead, or most villains and locations, you can probably justify the characters being knocked out or put to sleep, and then they wake up without being killed necessarily. I'd also like to do a video on sort of the best ways to introduce Strahd for the first time to your players. There's one method that's really popular. I did something different as an alternative that worked well. I'd like to talk about the pros and cons of those, plus other ways you can do it. And I also do Ravenloft videos. Like I said, I am running a post-Curse of Strahd Ravenloft campaign. My players are about level 14 at the moment. Originally I was going to go to about level 15, 16, but the way we're going is probably going to take them all the way to level 20. And what have I got planned for that? I think I want to do, so I've done some of the other domains. So like Barovia, there's other domains of Dread. And I think I've got Demonlieu, which is kind of like a big city. And Valachan, the deadly jungle I mentioned earlier in this video. And that's it from me. Thank you, Miss Wanderers.